The soft, low lighting of the restaurant was designed to make everyone look their best, casting a warm, golden glow on jewels and wine glasses. For her, it just made the long shadows stretch across the floor, reminding her of how late it was getting. Her feet ached, a dull, persistent throb that started in her heels and traveled all the way up her spine. She moved between the tables, a ghost in a black and white uniform. Her tray held steady with a practiced ease that had taken months to perfect. This place was a world away from anything she had ever known. A gilded cage where the air itself seemed to smell of money, a mix of expensive perfume, rich food, and the faint, metallic scent of polished silver. She was just a waitress here. An invisible part of the machinery that made the evening run smoothly for the people who could actually afford to eat here. They didn't see her. They saw a uniform, a hand that refilled a water glass, a voice that murmured, "Enjoy your meal." She heard snippets of their conversations as she passed talk of stock market fluctuations, planned trips to their summer homes in the Hamptons, complaints about the difficulty of finding good staff these days. It was like listening to a radio station from a different country, broadcasting in a language she once studied but no longer spoke fluently. Her world was the clatter of the kitchen, the weight of a loaded tray, the constant, low-grade stress of making sure every table was happy. Her world was the tight feeling in her chest when she thought about the rent that was due, the student loans that loomed like a dark cloud, the simple, crushing weight of being a grown-up. But tonight, there was something else in the air, a sound that cut through the noise and the chatter. It was coming from the grand piano in the corner. The piano was a beautiful beast, sleek and black, its polished surface reflecting the candlelight from a dozen tables. It was more of a decoration than an instrument, a symbol of the restaurant's sophistication. Most nights, a man was paid to sit and play it. He was an older man with a stiff back and an even stiffer expression. His playing was technically perfect, every note in its place, but it was empty. It was background music, the kind of sound you hear but never really listen to. It was the musical equivalent of the plain white walls of the restaurant. There, but without any soul or story to tell, Daj cleared a nearby table. Carefully stacking the heavy china plates, a particular melody drifted over to her. It was a Chopin nocturne, one she knew intimately. Her fingers, smudged with a bit of gravy from a plate, twitched. She could feel the keys under her fingertips, not as a memory, but as a phantom sensation. So real it almost made her drop the plates. She paused for a fraction of a second, her head cocked to the side, listening. The pianist played it well, of course. He hit all the right notes with the correct dynamics. But he missed the point. He played the notes, but he didn't play the music. He missed the heartache woven into the melody, the quiet desperation, the glimmer of hope in the final. Soft chords, a ghost of a memory surfaced, unbidden. She saw herself much younger, sitting in a sunlit room at a dusty old piano. The smell of rosin and old wood filled the air. Her father was there, his calloused hand resting on her shoulder, his voice thick with pride as she struggled through a difficult passage. "Feel it, don't just play it," he used to say. "The music is already in your heart. Your fingers just have to let it out." She had felt it then. The music was her whole world, her language, her one true love, but that world felt like a lifetime ago. It was a life that had been packed away in boxes and stored in the attic of her mind, right next to the memory of her father's smile and the smell of his workshop. The memory of his illness was sharper, more recent. The cold, sterile smell of the hospital room, the hushed voices of doctors, the endless pile of bills that had eaten up her savings and her dreams. The piano had been the first thing to go. It had broken her heart to sell it, but it had paid for 3 months of his care. After he was gone, there was nothing left to go back to. The dream of being a musician had felt like a luxury she could no longer afford, a beautiful, fragile thing that had to be crushed in order to survive. She shook her head. A small, almost invisible movement, as if to physically shake the memory away. She had a job to do. She was a waitress, not a pianist. That girl who could make the piano weep and sing was gone, replaced by this woman who knew the perfect way to fold a napkin and could carry 4 full wine glasses without spilling a drop. She had trained herself to be practical, to focus on what was real and in front of her. Rent was real. Aching feet were real. The music was just a ghost. She finished clearing the table and walked back towards the kitchen, her steps measured and deliberate. She forced herself to focus on the feel of the heavy plates in her hands, the warmth of the kitchen as she pushed through the swinging doors, the familiar shouts of the chefs. But as the doors swung shut behind her, cutting off the sound of the soulless piano, a single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away with the back of her hand, angry at herself for her weakness. There was no room for ghosts in this life. There was only work and the quiet, aching space where the music used to be. The kitchen was a brief, chaotic sanctuary. The heat from the stoves hit her like a wall, a welcome contrast to the carefully controlled chill of the dining room. For a few moments, she wasn't an invisible waitress. She was just another person in a noisy, bustling space. She dropped the dirty plates into the plastic bin, the clatter loud and satisfying. A chef yelled an order for a rare steak, and someone else shouted back that it was on its way. It was a world of sharp sounds and sharp smells, of sweat and speed, and it was real. But as soon as she turned to grab a fresh pitcher of water, the calm, composed mask had to go back on. She took a deep breath, pushed the swinging door open, and stepped back into the gilded cage. The evening had progressed. The initial hum of polite conversation had given way to a louder, more energetic buzz. Wine had been consumed, and the inhibitions of the wealthy diners were starting to loosen. Laughter was a little louder, gestures a little wider. She moved through it all, a steady ship in a sea of growing revelry, refilling water glasses and clearing away finished courses. Her mind was still half in the past, still hearing the ghost of a Chopin nocturne played with a heart that the current pianist, Mr. Gable, could never seem to find. The trouble started at a table in the center of the room. It was a group of men, all dressed in expensive but casual clothes, the kind of uniform that shouted, "I have so much money I don't need to try." One man in particular, the one who seemed to be the leader of their pack, was holding court. His laugh was a booming, attention-seeking sound that cut through the restaurant's sophisticated ambiance like a foghorn. He was leaning back in his chair, his arms spread wide as he told a story, his friends hanging on his every word. As Mr. Gable finished a piece, a lull fell in the man's storytelling. He turned his attention to the piano, a look of profound boredom on his face. "It's like a hospital in here," he said, just loud enough for his voice to carry a few tables. "Is this music or is it a sedative?" His friends chuckled, a chorus of sycophantic agreement. The pianist's back, which was always rigid, seemed to become a single, solid rod of ice. He didn't turn around, but his next piece began with a sharp, almost angry precision. The notes were perfect, but they were colder than before. Stripped of even the pretense of emotion, the man at the table was not deterred. He seemed to enjoy the reaction he was provoking. He took a loud sip of his wine, swirling the dark red liquid in his glass. "Come on, Gable," he called out, his voice dripping with a familiarity that was clearly unwelcome. "Play something with a pulse, something that makes you feel alive." A few more diners glanced over from their tables, a mixture of annoyance and curiosity on their faces. The manager, a thin, nervous man who was constantly patting his brow with a handkerchief, noticed the disturbance and began to make a slow, anxious path towards the table, like a ship navigating an iceberg field, but the man was just getting warmed up. His eyes scanned the room, looking for his next bit of entertainment. They passed over the other diners, the waiters, and then they landed on her. She was at a nearby table, quietly refilling a water glass. He'd seen her before, he realized. He'd seen her humming softly to herself as she worked, a faint, faraway look in her eyes. A cruel idea sparked in his gaze, a way to amplify his own amusement at the expense of others. "You," he said, his voice sharp and commanding. She looked up, startled, thinking he was calling for a waiter. He pointed a finger directly at her. The entire table fell silent and turned to look. "Yes, you." The waitress. Her heart sank. She knew what was coming. She had seen this kind of person before, the kind who saw service staff not as people, But as props in their own private drama, he leaned forward, a condescending smile spreading across his face. "You look like you have more rhythm in your little finger than this guy has in his whole body." His friends roared with laughter. The joke was on her, and she was the only one not laughing. A hot flush of humiliation crept up her neck, burning her cheeks. She could feel the eyes of the entire room on her now. The manager had arrived at the table, his face a mask of panic. "Sir, please," he began, his voice a nervous whisper. "Is there a problem with your service?" The man waved him away without even looking at him. "No problem at all. In fact, I'm trying to improve the ambiance." He turned his attention back to her, his eyes glinting with the light of $1,000 and a sense of entitlement. "I bet you $50 you can't even play chopsticks." The offer hung in the air, a cheap, tawdry thing in the middle of all this opulence. It wasn't a real bet. It was a public spectacle. It was a way to humiliate her and the pianist all at once. The room was utterly silent now. The clinking of silverware had stopped. The low hum of conversation had died. Every single person was looking at her. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, pinned in place by their collective gaze. She could feel the pity from some tables, the morbid curiosity from others. She saw Mr. Gable at the piano. He had stopped playing and turned slightly on his bench. A small, smug smile played on his lips. He was enjoying this. He was certain she would fail, and in her failure, his own sterile perfection would be vindicated. Her mind raced. She could refuse. She could just say, "No, thank you, sir. I have work to do." She could turn and walk back to the kitchen. But the man's challenge and the manager's powerlessness in the face of it had created a trap. Saying no would be an act of defiance, and she wasn't sure she was allowed to be defiant. She was just a waitress. Her job was to be agreeable, to absorb the whims of the clientele without complaint. Saying no could get her fired. And in that moment, under the weight of all those stares, the thought of losing this job, this tiring, soul-crushing job, was terrifying. She looked from the man's mocking face to the manager's pleading eyes. She saw her own reflection in the dark window of the restaurant, a small, insignificant figure in a black and white uniform. And then something inside her shifted. It was a tiny, flickering spark of anger. It wasn't a big, blazing fire, but it was enough to warm the cold, hollow space inside her. Why should she be ashamed? Why should she be the one to feel embarrassed? She wasn't the one behaving like a spoiled child. She thought about her father, about the pride in his eyes when she played. She thought about the dusty piano and the music that used to live inside her. This man, with his $50 and his cruel laughter, knew nothing about her. He saw a uniform, a servant, an easy target. He didn't see the girl who could make a piano sing. He didn't see the woman who had faced down far worse things than a rich man's taunts. The decision wasn't a conscious one. It was a feeling, a current of defiance that started in her toes and traveled up her spine, straightening it. She wasn't doing this for them. She wasn't doing this for his $50 or for the entertainment of this room. She was doing it for herself. She was doing it for the ghost of the girl with the music in her heart. She was doing it to prove to herself that she was still in there. Somewhere, without a word, she placed the water pitcher on a nearby table. The sound was a small, sharp click in the silent room. She smoothed her apron, a simple, unconscious gesture. Then she began to walk towards the piano. The silence that followed the man's challenge was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It pressed down on her, thick with unspoken judgments. Her face felt like it was on fire, a heat that started in her chest and crept up her neck, burning her cheeks with a shame so deep it felt like a physical weight. She could feel 100 pairs of eyes on her, their gazes like tiny, sharp needles pricking at her skin. She was no longer a person. She was an object of curiosity, a spectacle for the rich to enjoy between courses. Her first instinct, the most primal part of her brain screaming at her to run, was to refuse. She could just shake her head, mumble an apology, and back away towards the kitchen. The kitchen was safety. It was noise and heat and reality, a world away from this cruel, quiet theater. But her feet felt like they were nailed to the floor. She looked at the manager, whose face was a pale, sweaty mask of panic. He was giving her a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent plea to just play along, to not cause a scene, to do whatever it took to soothe the egos of the man who paid the bills. Losing this job wasn't an option. The rent was due next week, and her refrigerator was nearly empty. The fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. Her eyes flickered to the man who had put her in this position. He was leaning back in his chair, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. He was enjoying this. He was enjoying her discomfort, her powerlessness. He saw her as a thing, a puppet he could make dance for a $50 bill and the amusement of his friends. And then her gaze moved past him, to the pianist. Mr. Gable had swiveled on his bench to watch the show unfold. He wasn't smiling anymore, but there was a look of profound satisfaction on his face. He was waiting for her to fail, to fumble her way through a childish tune and prove that his own sterile, passionless playing was somehow superior because it was correct. Something inside her, something small and dormant, began to stir. It was a flicker of anger, hot and sharp. It wasn't the loud, explosive anger of the man at the table. It was a quiet, cold fury that burned deep within her. Why should she be the one to be ashamed? Why was she the one standing here, feeling small and worthless? She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just working. She was just trying to survive. The shame she felt wasn't hers. It belonged to them. It belonged to the man who thought his money gave him the right to humiliate people, and to the pianist who took pride in his empty perfection. A memory surfaced, unbidden and vivid. She was a little girl again, standing on a small wooden box in front of her old, upright piano. Her father was sitting on the sofa, listening. She had just finished playing a piece and she had missed a few notes. She was frustrated, her small hands clenched into fists. "I messed up," she had said, her voice trembling. But her father just smiled. "Music isn't about being perfect," he had told her, his voice gentle. "It's about feeling something. It's about telling a story, even if you miss a few words along the way. Your playing has a soul. Never let anyone take that away from you." His words echoed in her head, a voice from a lifetime ago. Never let anyone take that away from you. She looked at her hands, the hands that now refilled water glasses and carried heavy trays. For a moment she saw them as they used to be, small and determined, dancing across the keys. These were the same hands. The girl who loved music more than anything was still inside her, buried under years of exhaustion and worry and grief. She had let her go. She had packed that girl away in a box and told herself that she was gone for good, but she wasn't gone. And in this moment, faced with a room full of people who saw her as nothing, she realized that playing for them, for their amusement, would be the ultimate betrayal of that girl. It would be admitting that she really was just what they saw, a servant, a joke. But playing for herself, playing for the memory of her father and the girl she used to be, that was something else entirely. That was an act of defiance. The decision settled over her, not with a sudden jolt, but with a quiet, calm certainty. The fear was still there, a fluttering in her chest, but it was no longer in control. She was not going to play chopsticks. She was not going to be their monkey. She was going to play what she wanted to play. And if they laughed, so be it. At least she would be laughing at them, not with them, without a word. She placed the water pitcher she was still holding onto a nearby table. The small, sharp click of the glass on the wood seemed to break the spell. She took a deep breath, and as she let it out, she felt a change in her posture. Her shoulders, which had been slumped in a subconscious effort to make herself smaller, straightened. Her spine felt like a steel rod. She lifted her chin, not in arrogance, but in quiet self-respect. She began to walk towards the piano. It was the longest walk of her life. The distance from the center of the dining room to the corner where the piano sat was maybe 30 feet, but it felt like a mile. With every step, she could feel the eyes of the crowd on her. The hushed whispers followed her like a shadow. She didn't look at anyone. Her focus was narrowed to a single point, the smooth, black surface of the grand piano. Reflecting the candlelight like a pool of dark water. The crowd seemed to part for her as if by an invisible force. People leaned back in their chairs, their expressions a mixture of shock, pity, and morbid curiosity. The man who had challenged her watched her, his smirk gone, replaced by a look of confused surprise. He had expected her to refuse, or to cry, or to stumble over to the piano in a state of terror. He had not expected this. He had not expected this quiet, determined woman with the eyes of a soldier marching into battle. As she got closer, she could see the pianist more clearly. He had turned back to the piano, but he was watching her approach from the corner of his eye. His smugness had been replaced by a look of wary confusion. He didn't know what was happening, and he didn't like it. She reached the piano and stood beside it for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the polished wood. It was cool to the touch. She could smell the faint scent of old wood and lemon polish. It was a smell she knew, a smell from a different life. The room was so quiet she could hear the ticking of a clock on the far wall and the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Then she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She looked at the pianist, Mr. Gable, and gave him a small, polite nod. It wasn't a gesture of submission. It was a gesture of dismissal. She was not asking for his permission. She was simply informing him that his time was up. He seemed to understand. Without a word, he stood up from the bench, a stiff, jerky motion, and moved away, his face a mask of disbelief and indignation. He melted back into the shadows, just another member of the audience. She sat down on the velvet bench. It was soft and comfortable. She ran her fingers lightly over the cool, ivory keys, a familiar and comforting feeling. She could feel a slight tremor in her hands, a mix of fear and adrenaline. She took another deep breath, the air filling her lungs, and then let it out slowly. She positioned her fingers over the keys, her back straight to the room. She wasn't playing for them. She was playing for the ghost of her father and for the girl she thought she had lost forever. And in that moment, sitting at the grand piano in the middle of a luxury restaurant, she finally felt like she was coming home. The silence in the grand dining room was a living thing. It was heavy and thick, pressing in on her from all sides. She could feel the weight of 100 stares, 100 judgments, all focused on the back of her simple black uniform. The air, usually filled with the soft clinking of silverware and the murmur of expensive conversations, was now completely still. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for the punchline to a cruel joke. Her fingers rested on the cool, ivory keys. They felt both foreign and familiar, like an old friend she hadn't seen in years. There was a slight tremor. In her hands, a physical manifestation of the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She could feel her heart beating a frantic, nervous rhythm against her ribs. For a terrifying moment, she thought her mind had gone completely blank. The notes, the melodies, the feelings that had once been her entire world, were they still there? Or had they been buried too deep under layers of exhaustion and grief? She closed her eyes for a second, shutting out the room, the people, the expectations. She pictured her father's face not as it was at the end, but as it was when he was proud of her. She saw the way he would close his own eyes when she played, a small, peaceful smile on his lips, as if he could see the music itself. Feel it, don't just play it. His voice was a whisper in her mind, an anchor in a sea of anxiety. She took a slow, deep breath, and as she let it out, she began to play. The first note was a soft, hesitant sound, almost a question. It hung in the silent air, fragile and alone. A few people in the room shifted in their seats, a rustle of fabric that sounded like a thunderclap in the quiet. The man who had challenged her leaned forward, a smirk still playing on his lips, expecting a clumsy, fumbling attempt at a simple children's song. He was ready to laugh, but the second note followed, and then a third. It was the same Chopin nocturne that the other pianist had played earlier, but it was a completely different language. Where his version had been a perfect, sterile recitation of notes, hers was a conversation. It started as a whisper, a low, mournful melody that seemed to rise up from the very soul of the piano. It was the sound of loneliness, of quiet longing. It was the feeling of walking home alone on a cold night, with only the streetlights for company. The smirk began to fade from the man's face. He looked around at his friends, but they weren't looking at him anymore. Their eyes were fixed on the woman at the piano, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dawning awe. He had lost control of the room. The joke was on him, and he was just beginning to realize it. The music began to grow, slowly at first, then with more confidence. The melody became a river, flowing with a current of deep, unspoken sorrow. It was the sound of memories, of a sunlit room that no longer existed, of a father's laughter that was now just an echo. Her fingers, which had been trembling with fear, now moved with a certainty that was breathtaking to watch. They weren't just playing notes, they were telling a story. It was her story. The transformation in the dining room was remarkable. It was as if a spell had been cast. A woman putting a forkful of expensive steak into her mouth stopped, her hand frozen halfway to her lips. A man who had been gesturing wildly while telling a story let his hand fall to his side, his words forgotten. The clinking of ice and glasses had ceased. The low hum of conversation had died completely. The only sound in the entire opulent space was the music pouring from the heart of the waitress. The luxury crowd was frozen. Not in the awkward, uncomfortable way they had been before, but in a state of pure, captivated shock. They were accustomed to perfection. They paid for polished performances, for flawless service, for an experience that was smooth and predictable, but this was not perfect. There was a raw, unpolished edge to her playing, a slight hesitation here, a note played with just a little too much force there. It was technically flawed, but it was emotionally perfect. It was real. It was a glimpse into a world of genuine feeling, a world they rarely saw. Hidden behind their wealth and their carefully constructed lives, the manager stood near the entrance to the kitchen, his handkerchief forgotten in his hand. He was staring at his waitress, a woman he saw every day, a woman he knew only as a reliable employee. But the person sitting at the piano was a stranger. She was an artist, completely lost in her creation. He felt a strange mix of panic and pride. He knew he should probably stop this, get her back to her duties, but he couldn't move. He was as mesmerized as everyone else. Even Mr. Gable, the dismissed pianist, was caught in the spell. He stood in the shadows near the bar, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face was a mask of disbelief and a grudging, unwilling respect. He was hearing the same notes he played every night, but for the first time he was understanding them. He was hearing the story behind the music, the ache and the beauty that his own technical perfection had always missed. He felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years, professional jealousy, not for her skill, but for her soul. The music swelled, filling every corner of the room. It was no longer just sad, it was a tapestry of emotions. There was frustration. In the thundering chords, a cry against the unfairness of life. There was resilience in the way the melody always returned, soft but strong after a moment of chaos. And there was defiance, a powerful, soaring notes that climbed higher and higher, a declaration that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit cannot be broken. She was no longer aware of the room or the people in it. Her eyes were closed, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. She was back in that dusty conservatory. She was sitting at her father's side. She was pouring all the pain and joy of her life into the music. The piano was her voice, and for the first time in a long time, she was being heard. The melody began to soften, the river of sound calming into a gentle stream. The final notes were played with a lingering tenderness, a whisper of a promise that even after the sorrow there is still beauty. The last chord hung in the air, shimmering and delicate, vibrating in the crystal wine glasses and the very hearts of everyone listening. And then, silence. It was a profound, sacred silence. No one moved, no one spoke. They were frozen in the aftermath of the storm, the echoes of the music still ringing in their ears. The man who had started it all stared at his hands, as if seeing them for the first time. The luxury crowd, so quick to judge, so accustomed to being entertained, had been stripped bare by the raw honesty of a single, brave performance. They were not just frozen. They were changed. The final chord of the nocturne faded into the air, but its echoes seemed to hang in the room like a shimmering veil. For a full 10 seconds there was a silence so profound it was almost a sound in itself. It was a sacred, heavy quiet, the kind that follows a moment of shared intense emotion. No one moved. No one dared to breathe too loudly. It was as if the entire restaurant had been placed under a spell, frozen in the wake of the storm that had just passed through it. The man who had started it all stared at his hands, which were resting on the white tablecloth. He looked at them as if they belonged to someone else, as if they were the hands of a stranger who had done a foolish and cruel thing. The smirk was long gone, replaced by a look of raw, naked shock. He was a man who was used to controlling every room he entered, but he had completely lost control of this one. He had tried to create a moment of cheap entertainment, a small, cruel joke at someone else's expense, and instead he had inadvertently created a moment of pure, unvarnished truth. And that truth had stripped him bare. The manager stood frozen near the kitchen, his handkerchief still clutched in his sweaty palm. He looked at his waitress, at the woman who cleared tables and refilled water glasses, and saw a complete stranger. He saw an artist, a conduit for a power so deep and moving it had silenced a room full of the most powerful, jaded people in the city. He felt a strange, unfamiliar feeling bubbling up inside him, a mix of awe, pride, and a dawning, terrifying realization that his world and hers had just been irrevocably changed. Even the other pianist, Mr. Gable, stood in the shadows, his arms crossed loosely over his chest. The smugness and indignation had been wiped from his face, replaced by a look of grudging, almost painful respect. He was a master of the notes, but she was a master of the music. He had spent a lifetime perfecting his technique, only to be shown in the space of 5 minutes that technique without a soul is just an empty shell. He felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in decades, a genuine, humbling awe for another musician's gift. The spell was finally broken by a sound from the corner of the room. An elderly woman, her silver hair piled elegantly on her head, her diamonds glittering in the soft light, slowly began to clap. It wasn't a loud or enthusiastic clap. It was a slow, deliberate, almost reverent sound. Each clap was a separate, distinct beat, a recognition of the profound beauty they had all just witnessed. Her eyes were closed, and a single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. Her quiet applause was the catalyst. It was like the first crack in a dam. The man sitting next to her, a stern-looking man in a tailored suit, picked it up. Then another person joined in, and another. Within moments, the quiet clapping grew into a wave. It wasn't the polite, perfunctory applause that the other pianist received. This was a thunderous, overwhelming ovation. It was a roar of sound filled with emotion, a release of all the tension and feeling that had been building in the room. People were on their feet. Some were wiping their eyes. Others were just staring at the woman at the piano, their faces filled with a mixture of disbelief and profound gratitude. The sound washed over her, a physical force that startled her out of her trance. Her eyes flew open, and she seemed to see the room and the standing, cheering crowd for the first time. A look of pure, unadulterated panic flashed across her face. This was not her world. She was comfortable in the shadows, in the anonymity of her uniform. She was not prepared for this kind of attention, this raw outpouring of emotion directed at her. She didn't know how to accept it. She felt like an imposter, as if they were cheering for someone else. She stood up from the bench so quickly she almost stumbled. Without turning to face the room, she gave a small, awkward nod in the general direction of the applause. It was a gesture of dismissal, a plea for it to stop. Then she turned and practically fled from the piano, her footsteps quick and quiet on the thick carpet. She moved through the parting crowd like a ghost, her head down. Her only thought to get back to the safety of the kitchen, to the noise and the heat and the familiar reality of her job as she disappeared through the swinging doors. The applause began to die down, but the energy in the room remained. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The man who had challenged her was now diminished, his friends looking at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He was no longer the leader of the pack. He was the fool who had accidentally uncovered a masterpiece. The other pianist was forgotten, a footnote in a story that was no longer his. All anyone could talk about was the waitress, the woman with the music in her soul. In the kitchen, she leaned against a cold metal counter, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. The noise and chaos of the kitchen, which usually felt like a comfort, now seemed jarring and harsh. The swinging doors burst open, and the manager rushed in, his face a mixture of shock and elation. He stopped in front of her, opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water, unable to find the words. "That?" he finally managed to say, his voice a hoarse whisper. "That was... I had no idea." She just shook her head, unable to speak, the adrenaline of the performance and the terror of the applause leaving her feeling weak and drained. "I have to get back to work," she mumbled, pushing herself away from the counter, but he put a gentle hand on her arm. "No," he said, his voice firm but kind. "Your work is done for tonight." He looked at her with a new kind of respect, a look that went beyond the employer-employee relationship. He saw her, truly saw her, for the first time. As he spoke, she felt a strange, rectangular shape in the pocket of her apron. She reached in and pulled out a small, crisp business card. She didn't know how it had gotten there. She hadn't felt anyone put it in her pocket. It must have happened while she was walking back to the kitchen, a silent, unseen hand in the crowd. She looked at the card. It was simple and elegant, with a name and a phone number. Underneath the name it read, "Classical Artist Management." She stared at the card, her mind reeling. It was a key to a door she thought had been locked and bolted forever. It was a whisper from the universe, a sign that the path she had abandoned was still there, waiting for her. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The night wasn't over, and tomorrow she would still have to wake up and go to her job. But as she stood there in the noisy kitchen, the card felt like a heavy, promising weight in her hand. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a long, dark tunnel. It felt like a blank page, a new beginning. The music had been silent inside her for so long, but tonight it had finally found its voice again. And now it seemed it was ready to be heard by the world.